Have you ever felt a quiet emptiness, even when everything in your life seems perfect? The house is full of light, the job pays well, friends and family are around, and yet something is missing. It's as if no matter how much you chase, how much you achieve, or how many people applaud you, the sense of fulfillment slips through your fingers like fine sand spilling from a clenched hand. This is the invisible quest, the search for a peace that feels just out of reach. And it's a journey almost everyone embarks on, though few admit it aloud. We live in a world that constantly tells us that happiness is something we earn, something we acquire, something someone else can give to us. Buy this, achieve that, gain approval, be admired. The message is everywhere. Peace is external, attainable only through possessions, accolades, or relationships. But here's the paradox. The very things we chase to find happiness often keep it further away. The more we rely on the world to soothe our inner unrest, the more restless we become. It's a treadmill that never stops, a labyrinth with invisible walls, a river whose currents always pull us downstream without allowing us to rest. Imagine a traveler wandering through a vast desert. The sun blazes overhead, the sand stretches endlessly in every direction, and yet somewhere, just beyond the horizon, shimmers a mirage of water. The traveler runs toward it, desperate, hoping for relief, only to find the illusion disappears with every step. This is the journey of seeking peace outside oneself. Every achievement, every acquisition, every compliment is like that mirage, fleeting, temporary, illusory, and yet the longing persists. Deep inside, there is a quiet voice that whispers, "There must be more. There has to be a place where I can finally rest, a place where I can feel calm and whole." That voice is the first sign that the journey is about to turn inward. This inward turn is not always gentle. Often it comes through disillusionment. Perhaps a career milestone fails to bring the joy you expected. Perhaps a relationship ends, leaving you hollow despite all the love you gave. Or maybe it's subtler, a constant hum of dissatisfaction, a sense that life is moving faster than you can catch it, leaving your heart exhausted and untethered. It's in these moments of quiet despair, these small cracks of awareness, that the seed of true understanding begins to grow, the seed of a simple but profound truth. Peace comes from within. No one can give it to you. Notice the weight of that realization. It's both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it places the power of serenity squarely in your own hands. Terrifying because it reveals a responsibility that cannot be outsourced, delegated, or ignored. No amount of money, status, or approval can fill this inner void. No one can hand it to you like a gift. You must cultivate it yourself. This is the invisible quest, the search for a sanctuary inside yourself, a place untouched by chaos, unaffected by judgment, impervious to disappointment. It's a journey that demands courage because it asks you to face what's inside, the restless mind, the tangled emotions, the habitual patterns that have shaped your life. And yet, the reward is unlike anything the outside world can offer. A deep, enduring peace that remains even when storms rage around you. A calm so profound that applause or criticism loses its grip on your heart. A quiet joy that arises not from what you have, but from the very act of being fully present with yourself. In the coming moments, we will explore how this inner sanctuary is discovered, not as a distant goal, but as a living, breathing reality within reach of anyone willing to turn inward. We will uncover why so many of us seek outside what can only be nurtured inside, and how the wisdom of ages, told through stories, teachings, and lived experience, guides us toward that elusive peace. But for now, take a deep breath. Feel the air entering your lungs. Listen to the subtle rhythms of your own heartbeat. These are the first signs of a journey that is both extraordinary and profoundly simple. The journey that no one else can walk for you, yet one that ultimately leads to the most precious companion you will ever know, yourself. And as the world outside continues its endless rush, imagine the possibility of a quiet place within you, untouched by expectation, a sanctuary that awaits your attention. It's closer than you think. closer than you've allowed yourself to believe. And it begins here, with the recognition that true peace is not somewhere out there. It has always been waiting inside you. We live in a world that constantly whispers, "You will be happy once you have this, achieve that, or are admired by others." And it's hard not to believe it. Everywhere you look, happiness is framed as something you must chase, something to earn, something bestowed upon you by the outside world. Think about it. How many times have we linked our joy to a promotion at work, a perfect relationship, or even the number of likes on a post? We measure our self-worth by external signs, hoping that each one will finally fill the hollow spaces within. Yet with each achievement comes a subtle truth. The satisfaction is fleeting. It fades almost as quickly as it arrives, leaving the same emptiness we tried to escape. This is the illusion of external happiness. It's seductive because it appears tangible, concrete, and within reach. Money feels real, recognition feels real, possessions feel real, but real peace, that has a different texture, subtle, quiet, and often invisible to the eye. It cannot be weighed, counted, or displayed. And here lies the paradox. The more we invest our energy in chasing external markers, the further we drift from the very thing we seek. Consider the story of a young woman, ambitious and driven. She climbed the corporate ladder with unwavering determination, believing that each promotion would bring her fulfillment. She acquired the trappings of success: a beautiful apartment, a luxury car, weekends filled with social events. Yet at the end of each day, a quiet emptiness lingered. The accolades and achievements, though impressive to the outside world, failed to soothe her inner restlessness. She realized painfully that the happiness she sought could not be purchased or inherited. It had to be discovered from within. The Buddha long ago spoke of this truth. He called the world outside samsara, a place of constant change, craving, and impermanence. Everything we chase in the external world is subject to time, decay, and circumstance. A friend may betray us, a job may be lost, wealth may vanish. And when these inevitable shifts occur, we are left holding the very emptiness we hope to fill. And yet, society rarely teaches us to look inward. We are trained to compare, compete, and accumulate. Social media, advertising, and culture reinforce the illusion that happiness is external, that validation is found outside ourselves. Every scroll, every advertisement, every carefully curated image whispers the same message. You are not enough as you are. You need this, that, or them to be complete. But here's the quiet, radical truth. Nothing outside can make you truly whole. Peace is not a possession, a title, or a relationship. It cannot be bought, earned, or borrowed. It cannot arrive in an email or be gifted in a congratulatory speech. True peace is far more intimate, far more profound. It arises from a life aligned with self-awareness, mindfulness, and the courageous act of turning inward. And this is why the pursuit of external happiness can feel so painful. Every time we expect joy from the outside and it fails to deliver, a subtle disillusionment arises. It's not a failure of the world. It's a reflection of the mismatch between what we seek and where peace actually resides. It's a lesson, gently whispered, urging us to redirect our gaze. Some people spend decades chasing mirages, unaware that the oasis they crave has been inside them all along. They work tirelessly, collect accolades, cultivate appearances, and yet still wake up one morning to the same inner unrest. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, something shifts. A realization begins to stir. Perhaps the answer is not out there, but within. The illusion of external happiness is powerful, seductive, and almost universal. It shapes our decisions, fuels our desires, and sometimes defines our identity. Yet, recognizing it is the first step toward liberation. It is the moment when the mind pauses and asks, "Have I been seeking fulfillment in all the wrong places?" And as that question takes root, a new path begins to emerge. A path that doesn't rely on validation, possessions, or circumstance. A path that gently nudges us toward the inner landscape, where true peace waits quietly, patiently, for us to notice it. In that space, we begin to see that the world outside is not the enemy. Life in its richness and unpredictability continues as it always has, but it no longer controls the measure of our happiness. The external becomes a reflection, not the source, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the restless chase begins to soften. This awakening is subtle. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks or fanfare. Instead, it arrives in small moments. A pause in the rush of the day, a deep breath taken with awareness, the quiet satisfaction of simply being present. And in these moments, the mind begins to glimpse the truth, that the journey to real peace doesn't start in a corner office, a shopping mall, or on a social feed. It starts within. And as we continue this journey, we will explore how this inner peace is discovered, not as a distant dream, but as a living, breathing presence that exists right now, waiting to be recognized, nurtured, and embraced. It is a peace that transforms not just how we feel, but how we experience the world itself, turning ordinary moments into extraordinary opportunities for serenity. We have spent our lives searching outward, chasing success, approval, possessions, and fleeting pleasures, only to discover again and again that true contentment cannot be found in the world outside. The realization is subtle but profound. The source of peace has always been inside us, and yet it is often the most overlooked place of all. Look around. The world is loud, chaotic, and endlessly distracting. Every moment seems to demand our attention, pulling us toward what is urgent rather than what is essential. We are so immersed in external demands that the idea of turning inward feels foreign, even uncomfortable. But it is precisely in this inward gaze that a sanctuary exists, a quiet, unwavering presence that is untouched by the turmoil outside. To look within is not to escape the world. It is to see it clearly while maintaining a center of calm. It is the practice of noticing your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations, without judgment. Imagine standing beside a river watching the current flow. You don't need to jump in or stop the water. You simply observe it, aware of its movement but not carried away. This is the essence of turning inward, awareness without attachment, presence without being swept by the tides of desire, fear, or expectation. In Buddhist teachings, this inward journey is often called mindfulness or awareness. It is the gentle act of becoming present with yourself, moment by moment. Through mindfulness, the mind begins to untangle itself from the endless chatter that creates restlessness. The breath becomes a bridge, a simple, tangible anchor connecting you to the here and now. With each mindful breath, a small window of peace opens, revealing the stillness that has always been there. But peace does not come automatically. It requires patience and courage. The first time you sit quietly with yourself, you may feel discomfort, boredom, or even resistance. Old habits of distraction rise and the mind protests. This is normal. These reactions are not obstacles, they are signposts pointing to the areas within that need attention, compassion, and understanding. Consider a person who spends hours scrolling through social media, seeking validation and distraction. One day they decide to close the screen, sit in silence, and simply observe their thoughts. At first, anxiety bubbles up. What should I be doing? Am I missing something? Yet, as moments pass, a new awareness begins to emerge. They notice the rhythm of their breath, the gentle rise and fall of the chest, the subtle sensations of their body. In this quiet observation, a small but undeniable sense of peace appears. It is not dramatic, but it is real. It is proof that the source of calm does not lie outside, it lies within. This inward journey also reveals another truth. The mind is not your enemy. Every thought, feeling, and sensation is an invitation to understand yourself more deeply. When anger arises, it signals a need for compassion. When fear emerges, it points to a need for courage. When longing appears, it shows where attachment lies. Observing these experiences without judgment transforms them from obstacles into teachers. The path of peace is paved with understanding, not resistance. And the beauty of looking within is that it is accessible to everyone. You don't need a special place, a particular status, or external conditions to begin. Every breath, every moment of awareness, Every pause in the rush of life is an opportunity to touch that inner sanctuary. The key is consistency and intention. Each time you notice your thoughts, each time you return to the present, you water the seed of peace that has always existed within you. Stories of those who have discovered this truth are simple yet profound. A monk sitting quietly in the forest, a teacher pausing in the middle of a busy day, an ordinary person taking a few mindful breaths before responding to a stressful email, all illustrate the same principle. Peace is not found in changing the world outside, but in transforming the relationship with what is already here. And here lies the paradox. By turning inward, you do not withdraw from life, you engage with it more fully. You begin to respond rather than react, to see clearly rather than be blinded by impulse. The world continues to shift, people continue to challenge you, and circumstances continue to change, but your center remains unshaken. This is the essence of true peace. It is important to remember that this is not an instant transformation. Looking within is a lifelong journey, a continuous practice of observing, understanding, and embracing yourself. Some days will feel effortless, others will feel like an uphill climb. Both are part of the path. Each moment of awareness, each breath taken with intention, is a step toward discovering the source of peace that has been waiting for you all along. And as you begin to notice this calm, even briefly, a new question emerges. If peace comes from within, what exactly do we need to let go of to fully experience it? It is here, on the edge of understanding, that we begin to encounter the internal obstacles that have long obscured our serenity. The fears, desires, and attachments that cloud the mind and keep us from recognizing our own innate stillness. The journey inward reveals that true peace is not passive or stagnant. It is dynamic, alive, and deeply transformative. By observing, understanding, and nurturing what lies within, we begin to reclaim a sense of wholeness and presence that cannot be taken away by external circumstance. The river of life continues to flow, yet we stand anchored, connected, and aware, ready to engage with the world from a place of calm and clarity. As we turn our gaze inward, the first profound realization begins to take shape. Peace is not something anyone can give us. No achievement, no relationship, no external validation can provide it. True serenity is not a gift handed to us by circumstance or by others. It is a responsibility. And this responsibility, though empowering, can feel heavy at first. Imagine holding a delicate flame in your hands. If you wait for someone else to protect it, to nurture it, the flame is at constant risk. But when you take ownership, when you become the guardian of that flame, it begins to glow steadily, unaffected by the winds outside. This flame is your peace, your calm, your inner sanctuary. You are the one who tends it. You are the one who nurtures it. The concept of self-responsibility is central to the path of inner peace. In Buddhist philosophy, it is understood that our happiness, our suffering, and our freedom from turmoil are all within our own domain. The mind is both the source of our pain and the key to our liberation. By cultivating awareness, practicing mindfulness, and observing our patterns of thought and behavior, we begin to reclaim the power that has always been ours. Consider the ordinary moments in life: an argument with a colleague, a disagreement with a loved one, an unexpected setback. In each of these moments, it is easy to point outward, to blame circumstances, to feel at the mercy of events beyond our control. Yet, every time we allow external conditions to dictate our inner state, we give away our power. Peace, by its very nature, cannot flourish when we hand our responsibility over to the world. Taking responsibility does not mean rejecting life's challenges or denying the pain we experience. Rather, it means acknowledging that our reactions, our interpretations, and our choices are ours alone. We cannot control the waves, but we can learn to navigate them with balance and grace. By choosing how we respond, we reclaim the authority over our inner world. Stories of transformation often begin with this shift in perspective. A person may spend years blaming others for their dissatisfaction, parents, partners, colleagues, society at large. And yet, when they finally recognize that peace cannot be outsourced, that serenity must be cultivated from within, the true work begins. It is not easy. Old habits, conditioned responses, and ingrained patterns resist change. But with patience and conscious effort, the mind gradually learns to settle, like water calming after a storm. Self-responsibility also invites us to take proactive steps. Meditation, journaling, mindful breathing, reflection on one's actions. All of these are tools we employ to nurture the inner sanctuary. Each act is an assertion of agency, a choice to prioritize the state of our mind over the chaos of the external world. Over time, these small, deliberate actions accumulate into a resilient foundation of peace. There is another subtle but powerful truth here. When we take responsibility for our inner state, we no longer wait for permission or validation. We no longer tie our contentment to the whims of others. We become the architects of our own serenity. The external world continues its constant flux, but we navigate it with clarity, compassion, and unwavering steadiness. Imagine a life lived this way. Even in moments of difficulty, the mind remains grounded. Challenges are met not with reactive fear or frustration, but with conscious choice. Relationships deepen because we bring our calm presence rather than seeking fulfillment in others. Work becomes more meaningful because our motivation stems from alignment with our values rather than a desperate grasping for approval. This is the power of self-responsibility. It liberates. It transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. By embracing the role of caretaker of our own peace, we discover that serenity is not elusive. It is always accessible, always present, waiting for us to claim it. And yet, taking responsibility is not a solitary act. It ripples outward. When we embody calm, clarity, and compassion, the world responds. Interactions with others shift. Tension softens. The collective atmosphere becomes lighter. By tending our own flame, we quietly illuminate the spaces around us. So, as we cultivate this sense of ownership over our inner life, we arrive at a powerful truth. The key to lasting peace is not perfection but commitment. It is not the absence of difficulty, but the conscious choice to meet life with awareness, presence, and care. Each moment offers an opportunity to practice, to refine, and to reaffirm that peace is ours to nurture. And in this space of personal responsibility, a new awareness begins to emerge. The obstacles we encounter, the fears, desires, and attachments that cloud our mind, are not enemies. They are guides. They point the way to what still needs attention, what still requires understanding and compassion. And as we confront these inner challenges with honesty and grace, the path toward true serenity becomes clearer. The journey is ongoing, subtle, and profound. By embracing the power of self-responsibility, we do not merely react to life. We shape our inner world, cultivating a peace that is enduring, resilient, and deeply transformative. And as this realization settles, we begin to glimpse the next stage of the journey, identifying and releasing the very obstacles that have long kept our serenity hidden. Even as we begin to embrace self-responsibility, we encounter an undeniable truth. Peace is not something we simply switch on. The mind is a complex landscape filled with hidden currents that can pull us away from serenity. Fear, anger, and desire. These are the silent obstacles that shape much of our inner experience. They are not inherently evil, nor are they signs of weakness. They are signals, reflections of our attachments, conditioning, and unresolved tensions. Fear is perhaps the most pervasive. It creeps into every corner of our consciousness, often unnoticed. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of the unknown, all of these shape the way we act, think, and react. Fear can paralyze, distort reality, and create imagined threats that hold us hostage. Yet when observed with awareness, fear becomes a teacher. It shows us where we cling too tightly, where we resist change, where we need courage. Anger is the flame that rises when expectations collide with reality. It erupts when we feel wronged, misunderstood, or challenged. Anger, unchecked, clouds judgment, damages relationships, and fuels suffering. But anger, too, has a lesson. It illuminates our boundaries, our values, and the areas where our compassion is yet untested. Observed without judgment, it transforms from a destructive force into a guide, revealing what the heart truly needs to address. Desire. The third obstacle is perhaps the most subtle and insidious. It drives ambition, fuels cravings, and propels us toward constant striving. Desire itself is not inherently bad, it is the energy of life. But when it becomes grasping, clinging, and obsessive, it becomes a source of dissatisfaction. The more we chase, the more restless we become. Desire teaches us the importance of moderation, balance, and the distinction between what nourishes and what consumes. Imagine a traveler walking through a dense forest. Each obstacle, fear, anger, desire, is like a thorned vine blocking the path. Step lightly, observe carefully, and the path gradually clears. Retreat, resist, or ignore these obstacles, and they entangle us further. Awareness is the key. By noticing these currents without being swept away, we reclaim the ability to move with clarity and intention. Buddhist teachings describe these forces as the three poisons: Trishna, craving; Devesha, aversion/anger; and Moha, delusion/fear/ignorance. They are the root causes of suffering, the hidden architects of much of our inner turmoil. Recognizing them is the first step. Learning to respond skillfully is the journey. Skillful response is not suppression or denial. It is understanding, observing, and allowing these forces to exist without granting them ultimate control. Consider a moment from everyday life. A colleague criticizes your work, triggering anger. Your first impulse might be to lash out, justify, or defend. But if you pause, breathe, and observe the rising emotion, you may notice a fear of inadequacy beneath the anger, or a desire for recognition that has gone unmet. By seeing these layers, the emotion transforms from a reaction into insight. You gain choice. You gain freedom. Desire works similarly. The longing for possessions, status, or approval often drives our decisions. The moment we cling to outcomes, we create tension and disappointment. Yet when we notice desire without attachment, like watching clouds drift across the sky, we reclaim our center. The craving no longer dictates our peace. These obstacles are not just abstract concepts. They are alive in our daily experiences, shaping our relationships, decisions, and even our sense of self. Yet paradoxically, they are also the doorways to greater understanding. Each fear faced, each anger observed, each desire understood becomes a stepping stone toward inner freedom. The practice of mindfulness, meditation, and self-reflection is essential here. Each moment of awareness is like a lantern in the dark forest, illuminating the path, revealing the patterns that have long gone unnoticed. Through consistent observation, the mind slowly disentangles itself from the thorns of fear, anger, and desire, revealing the calm, open space that lies beneath. And this is where courage comes in. Not the courage to fight the world outside, but the courage to face the world within. To witness the mind's turbulence without judgment, to accept the currents as part of the journey, and to cultivate the inner resilience that allows peace to emerge even in the midst of turmoil. As these obstacles are observed and understood, they lose their power to control us. Fear no longer dictates avoidance. Anger no longer dictates retaliation. Desire no longer dictates endless craving. The path forward begins to open, not in grand revelations but in subtle moments. A mindful breath, a calm response, a quiet pause before action. Each moment reinforces the truth we have glimpsed before, that the source of peace resides within us, ready to be nurtured, protected, and expanded. And as the thorns of fear, anger, and desire gradually release their hold, the mind begins to settle. The inner sanctuary we have been seeking comes into clearer view. It is here, behind the turbulence, that the next stage of the journey emerges. The tools, practices, and daily rituals that allow us to cultivate and sustain that peace over time. We have seen the obstacles that lie within fear, anger, desire, and we have begun to take responsibility for our inner state. Yet knowing and understanding alone are not enough. The mind is a living, restless force, and left unattended, it will continue to wander, pull, and agitate. This is where the tools of mindfulness and meditation become indispensable. Mindfulness is simple in concept but profound in effect. It is the practice of paying attention, fully, openly, and without judgment to the present moment. It is noticing your breath, your thoughts, your body, and the world around you with the curiosity of a child seeing everything for the first time. Mindfulness is not about stopping thoughts or controlling emotions. It is about observing them clearly, allowing them to pass like clouds drifting across the sky, without clinging or resisting. Meditation, in turn, is a structured form of this awareness. It provides a dedicated space, a container for the mind to settle and observe itself. Through meditation, we learn to anchor ourselves in the present, to watch the rise and fall of thoughts, and to meet emotions with calm attention. Over time, this practice transforms the way we experience life. The turbulence of the mind softens, clarity emerges, and the deep well of inner peace that we have been seeking becomes more accessible. Consider a person sitting quietly, eyes closed, focusing on the breath. At first, the mind races, memories, worries, plans, judgments all rush through. This is normal. Awareness is not about perfection, it is about recognition. Each time the mind wanders, each time we notice and gently return to the breath, we are exercising patience, focus, and self-compassion. These moments, seemingly small, accumulate into profound shifts in consciousness. Mindfulness is not confined to meditation sessions alone. It can be woven into the fabric of everyday life. Eating becomes a practice when we truly notice flavors, textures, and sensations. Walking becomes a meditation when we feel each step, the connection to the ground, the rhythm of movement. Conversations become deeper when we listen fully, without judgment, without planning our response. In this way, the tools of mindfulness and meditation extend beyond the cushion, infusing each moment with awareness and presence. The benefits are both subtle and profound. With mindfulness, fear loses its grip, anger softens, and desire becomes tempered with clarity. We begin to see the impermanent nature of our thoughts and emotions, recognizing them as passing phenomena rather than defining truths. The mind becomes a mirror, reflecting reality as it is, rather than distorting it through habitual reactions. Stories of transformation abound. A teacher in a bustling city begins a daily meditation practice for 10 minutes. Over weeks, small changes emerge. Patience in traffic, calm in disagreements, clarity in decision-making. Another person notices the first sparks of joy in routine moments, simply because they are fully present. These tools, when practiced consistently, create an inner environment where peace can flourish, resilient to the storms of life. Yet the power of mindfulness and meditation lies not just in personal peace, but in their ripple effect. When we approach life with presence, we interact with others from a place of clarity and compassion. Tensions ease, conflicts resolve more gracefully, and relationships deepen. The inner sanctuary we cultivate becomes a quiet force in the world, subtle yet transformative. To begin, one does not need perfection, long hours, or special conditions. A single mindful breath, a moment of noticing the body, a pause before reacting, these are the seeds. Nurture them consistently, and they grow into a garden of serenity that remains even when circumstances are challenging. And as we use these tools to anchor ourselves, the path forward becomes clearer. The obstacles within fear, anger, desire remain, but they no longer dominate our inner landscape. We have discovered a method to meet the mind, to observe it, and to guide it toward balance. And in this clarity, a new realization begins to emerge. Peace is not a distant goal. It is a living, present reality, accessible whenever we choose to notice it. Through mindfulness and meditation, we not only tame the turbulence of the mind, but cultivate the ability to respond skillfully to life. Each breath becomes a reminder, each moment a practice, each day an opportunity to deepen our connection to the source of peace within. And as we continue to explore, the next step naturally unfolds. Learning the art of letting go, the graceful release of what no longer serves us. Even as we cultivate mindfulness and practice meditation, there comes a moment when we realize that inner peace cannot thrive while we cling. Clinging to what is familiar, to what feels safe, to what we think defines us. This is the silent weight that burdens the mind. The art of letting go is not about giving up, surrendering ambition, or detaching from life itself. It is about releasing the unnecessary, the heavy, and the illusory so that the heart and mind can breathe freely. Imagine holding a stone in your hand. At first, it feels like a source of strength, something solid to anchor you. But over time, the weight becomes exhausting. Every step forward is harder. The stone was never meant to be carried indefinitely. Letting go is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that holding on to the wrong things keeps us from moving toward what truly matters: clarity, peace, and presence. In Buddhist philosophy, this principle is central. Attachment, aversion, and delusion, the very forces we explored in fear, anger, and desire, create suffering when we cling to them. Letting go is the practice of seeing these forces clearly and choosing not to be controlled by them. It is the courage to release expectations, to forgive, to release resentment, and to accept impermanence as the natural flow of life. Consider the story of a person burdened by anger towards someone who wronged them. The memory plays repeatedly in their mind, reigniting frustration and pain. Holding on to this anger feels justified. It protects the self, maintains the illusion of control. Yet each replay of the grievance is a chain around the heart. The act of letting go does not mean forgetting or condoning the harm. It means recognizing the cost of carrying that weight and consciously choosing freedom. Desire, too, teaches us the value of release. We often chase achievements, possessions, or approval, believing that happiness lies in acquisition. But the more tightly we grasp, the more restless the mind becomes. Letting go of excessive craving does not extinguish motivation, it refines it. It allows us to pursue what truly nourishes the soul rather than what merely entertains the ego. And then there is the subtle art of releasing self-identity. Much of our suffering stems from clinging to a fixed sense of who we are, what we must achieve, and how others must perceive us. When we loosen these rigid expectations, the mind becomes fluid, adaptable, and open. We begin to see life as a dynamic dance rather than a battle to prove ourselves. Letting go is an ongoing practice. It is not a single act but a continuous process of noticing, acknowledging, and releasing. In daily life, it may appear in small moments: forgiving someone without expecting an apology, stepping back from a situation without reacting, choosing not to dwell on a negative thought. Each act is a liberation, a reclaiming of energy that was previously tied to attachment or resistance. The rewards of release are subtle at first but profound over time. A lighter heart, a calmer mind, a clearer perspective. These are the gifts that emerge when we stop holding onto what no longer serves us. The turbulence of life continues, yet we navigate it with ease, grace, and a steady center. The mind that was once weighed down by fear, anger, and desire begins to experience true spaciousness. Stories from the lives of those who practice letting go are simple yet illuminating. A monk relinquishes attachment to status and comfort, finding freedom in simplicity. An ordinary person forgives past grievances, discovering relief in the liberation of the heart. A teacher releases expectations in relationships, noticing that connection deepens when control is relinquished. In each case, letting go is not a loss. It is an opening, an invitation to presence, joy, and authenticity. And as the mind learns to release, we begin to notice an extraordinary shift. Peace is no longer an occasional visitor, it becomes a companion. The inner sanctuary cultivated through mindfulness and meditation is now uncluttered, ready to expand. This release does not stop with ourselves, it ripples outward. Our interactions with others become less reactive, more compassionate, and more attuned to the subtle currents of life. Ultimately, the art of letting go is the bridge between understanding and embodiment. It transforms intellectual insight into lived experience. Through mindful release, we discover that the peace we have been seeking was never lost. It was only obscured by our attachment, aversion, and clinging. And in this spaciousness, we are free to embrace the present fully, without the weight of unnecessary burdens. From here, the journey naturally deepens into integrating this inner peace into everyday life, not as a temporary state, but as a living, breathing presence that informs every thought, action, and interaction. And as we step forward, we begin to see how serenity can flow from the quiet sanctuary within into the bustling world around us. We have explored the nature of the mind, faced the obstacles within, and practiced mindfulness, meditation, and the art of letting go. But true inner peace is not a concept to admire from afar. It is a living presence, meant to flow into every moment of our daily life. Integrating serenity into ordinary experiences transforms existence from routine to meaningful, from reactive to intentional. Daily life is often busy, noisy, and unpredictable. Tasks pile up, deadlines loom, relationships demand attention, and the mind constantly leaps from thought to thought. In this whirlwind, peace can feel elusive, as if it belongs only to quiet meditation rooms or distant retreats. Yet the truth is that the sanctuary we cultivate within is portable. It can accompany us wherever we go, infusing ordinary actions with extraordinary presence. Integration begins with awareness. Each moment offers a choice: to act automatically, driven by habit, or to engage with intention and mindfulness. Even the simplest activities, a cup of tea, washing dishes, walking to the store, become opportunities to practice presence. Feeling the warmth of the cup in your hands, noticing the scent of the tea, sensing the texture of the water while washing dishes, or hearing the rhythm of your footsteps. These small acts anchor you in the now. Presence transforms the mundane into a doorway to serenity. Equally important is the awareness of our interactions. How often do we speak, react, or judge without noticing the emotional currents guiding our words? By pausing, observing, and responding consciously, we allow peace to shape our relationships. A calm mind listens before replying. A patient heart responds instead of reacting. Conflict softens, misunderstandings diminish, and connections deepen. This is the subtle power of integrating inner peace into daily life. The inner sanctuary shapes the outer world without force, quietly, naturally. Mindful routines and rituals further support this integration. Begin each day with a few minutes of mindful breathing, setting an intention to remain present. Pause at intervals before meals, before starting a task, or when transitioning from one activity to another. These pauses, however brief, serve as touchstones, reminding the mind to return to its center. Over time, these moments accumulate into a habitual state of awareness that colors the entire day. Integration also involves self-compassion. Life is imperfect, unpredictable, and at times overwhelming. The mind will wander, emotions will surge, and mistakes will happen. Instead of self-criticism, approach yourself with kindness. Recognize that inner peace is cultivated gradually, step by step, moment by moment. Each lapse is an opportunity to notice, learn, and return to presence, not a failure. Stories of ordinary people reveal the transformative power of this integration. A parent, once consumed by frustration and impatience, begins to breathe through moments of tension with a child, noticing the fleeting nature of each phase. A professional, facing a stressful workload, discovers calm by grounding attention on one task at a time. A commuter caught in traffic practices mindful breathing, turning irritation into presence. In each case, peace does not remove challenges, it changes the way they are experienced. Beyond personal experience, integrating inner peace radiates outward. A calm individual influences the environment, softens tense situations, and inspires harmony through presence rather than words. Peace becomes contagious, a quiet force shaping the atmosphere of homes, workplaces, and communities. The essence of integration is not extraordinary effort. It is consistent attention to the present, compassionate engagement with oneself, and mindful interaction with the world. Inner peace ceases to be a retreat from life. It becomes the foundation upon which life is fully lived. And as inner peace flows into daily life, a deeper awareness emerges. True serenity is not confined to meditation, rituals, or deliberate practices. It permeates every act, every choice, every encounter. It becomes a living presence, a lens through which the world is experienced with clarity, patience, and grace. And from this understanding arises a natural question. If inner peace can transform ordinary life, what happens when we face life's ultimate uncertainties? Aging, illness, loss, and death. It is here that the wisdom cultivated within becomes most profound, revealing the resilience and depth of serenity that carries us through even the most challenging moments. By now, we have explored the journey inward, mindfulness, meditation, letting go, and integrating peace into everyday life. Yet the true power of inner serenity is not contained solely within ourselves. Peace, once discovered, does not remain isolated. Like a pebble dropped into still water, it ripples outward, touching everything around us in ways both subtle and profound. Consider the ordinary interactions of daily life. A conversation with a colleague, a shared meal with a friend, a smile offered to a stranger. These moments, seemingly small, carry the potential to reflect the inner calm cultivated within. When we respond from a place of serenity rather than agitation, we influence the environment without force, creating a space where harmony can grow. The ripple effect begins quietly. A calm presence disarms tension in an argument. A compassionate word softens the heart of someone in distress. A mindful action models patience and awareness for others. These effects are rarely immediate or dramatic, but they are cumulative. Over time, they shape relationships, communities, and even cultures. Peace becomes contagious, not through preaching or instruction, but through living example. Stories abound of this quiet transformation. A teacher who remains composed in the midst of chaos inspires students to approach challenges with steadiness. A leader who makes decisions from clarity and compassion fosters a culture of respect and trust. A parent who embodies patience and mindfulness nurtures children who carry these qualities into the world. In each instance, the inner sanctuary of one individual radiates outward, creating a subtle but lasting impact. Buddhist philosophy emphasizes this interconnectedness. Our actions, thoughts, and presence affect not only ourselves, but the web of life in which we participate. The serenity we cultivate within contributes to the collective atmosphere. When peace becomes our default state, it shifts the energy of our surroundings, creating conditions where understanding, cooperation, and compassion can flourish. The ripple effect also challenges the illusion that the world shapes us more than we shape it. While external events will always occur, our response to them defines the quality of our interactions and the tone of our environment. By maintaining an inner calm, we navigate difficulties with clarity, and others are subtly invited to respond in kind. Our peace becomes a silent influence, shaping the world in ways that words alone could never achieve. Moreover, this ripple effect demonstrates that spiritual practice is not separate from life. It is not an isolated pursuit confined to meditation cushions or retreat centers. Rather, it manifests in every choice, every interaction, and every moment of presence. The impact of our inner work is most visible in ordinary life, where patience, compassion, and clarity transform the mundane into a field for conscious action. Yet the transformation is not only outward. As we influence the world, we also reinforce our own serenity. Each act of mindful engagement strengthens the inner sanctuary, creating a feedback loop of presence, compassion, and resilience. Peace becomes self-reinforcing, a living force that nurtures both the individual and the collective. This is the essence of the ripple effect. The journey inward does not end within the confines of the mind or heart. It flows outward, shaping lives, relationships, and the environment with quiet, unassuming power. Each breath, each act of awareness, Each moment of intentional presence becomes a contribution to a larger wave of harmony. And as we witness the impact of our inner peace, we begin to see the final stage of this journey, how this cultivated serenity accompanies us through life's ultimate transition. The same presence, clarity, and acceptance that transform our daily experiences also guide us in facing the unknown with courage and equanimity. Our journey has been long, winding through the landscapes of the mind, heart, and soul. We began with the invisible quest for peace, explored the illusions of external happiness, and discovered that the source of serenity has always been within us. We faced fear, anger, and desire, learned to turn inward, practiced mindfulness and meditation, and embraced the art of letting go. We brought that peace into daily life and witnessed how it ripples outward, transforming the world around us. And now, as we reach the final reflection, one truth shines clearly: peace is not a distant destination. It is not something to be earned, acquired, or obtained. It is a living presence, accessible in every breath, every step, every thought, and every interaction. It has always been here, waiting quietly, patiently for us to notice, nurture, and embrace it. The journey within is neither linear nor complete. It is ongoing, evolving with each day, each moment of awareness. Some days the mind may wander into old patterns of fear or attachment. Some days life's chaos may test our calm. Yet every return to presence, every act of observation, every moment of conscious choice is a victory, a reaffirmation that we hold the power to cultivate our inner sanctuary. This inner journey is profoundly personal, yet deeply universal. Every human being carries within them the same potential for serenity, the same capacity for clarity, compassion, and wisdom. By tending our own inner garden, we not only find liberation for ourselves, but become living examples of what is possible. We create ripples of peace that touch others, often in ways too subtle to measure, yet profoundly real. And so, the journey continues, not as a series of chapters, but as a living practice. Mindfulness, reflection, compassion, and release become companions along the path. Life continues with all its unpredictability, yet we move through it with presence, grounded in the understanding that our peace is our own responsibility, our own creation, and our own gift. As we step into each new day, we carry with us the quiet wisdom we have discovered, that serenity is not given, not found outside, but nurtured within. It is in this stillness that clarity emerges, compassion blooms, and joy, subtle yet profound, fills the spaces of our being. So pause, breathe, look within. Allow the calm that has always been there to rise, to expand, to guide you. And in doing so, let your inner peace flow outward, touching the world in ways both visible and unseen. Because the journey within is not just a path to tranquility. It is a life fully lived, a presence fully realized, and a legacy of serenity that continues long after the moments of practice have passed. If this journey into the heart of inner peace resonated with you, consider joining us on Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe and be part of a space where calm, clarity, and timeless teachings meet your everyday life. Take a moment to pause, breathe, and carry this peace with you. And if you feel called, share this video so others may discover the quiet sanctuary within themselves as well. Remember, the path to serenity begins within, and every step you take nurtures not only your own heart, but the world around you.